An educator of Bolivar, amongst others. And the line is, inventamos o erramos. We invent or we err. And the Argentine philosopher of education, Walter Cohen, offers us an insightful interpretation of this line in his latest book on Rodriguez. And he says that we should read Rodriguez. I'll pronounce his name in Portugal, because I lived in Brazil for a while, so I'll get the R's all wrong. But it should be Rodriguez. As saying that, so according to Cohen, Rodriguez is telling us that we err when we copy and reproduce education theory and practice, which reproduces socioeconomic inequalities. And that for Rodriguez, this is what has occurred over and over and over again in Europe and the United States. Now he's speaking in the 1800s, basically. So in short, why copy the most dominant models there? Rodriguez is asking at the time. Instead, we need to do what has never been done before, he says. And that what needs to be done can be done in Latin America. And that is, invent a system of education. And for Rodriguez, this also means a state which allows for equality for all. And so in sum, Rodriguez challenges those of his time and us today to invent new ways of thinking and practicing education. So at LAPES, one of the central questions with which we're concerned with is born out of this short line from Rodriguez, and that is, can Latin American philosophy of education, LAPE, help us here in the US and in Canada and other English-speaking countries invent new philosophies and ways of practicing education? So in a sense, we're continuously experimenting with ways of responding to this question. That's kind of our mojo, right? Mm-hmm. A brief history of our group. We basically founded ourselves a year ago, 3 doctoral students, and then since then we've grown to include others, including Ariana, and we're pretty open door in that regard. Anyone that has a project that wants to contribute usually jumps in. We're currently housed and supported by the Center for the Studies of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. And I'd like to go over some of our general aims and how we try to reach those aims, and then talk a little bit about some theory of research that might be interesting for people to jump in on. So some of our aims are basically that, and I should say this from the beginning, that as a group, we definitely have more questions than we have answers. You might say, like the Zapatistas, that preguntando caminamos, questioning we walk. Mm-hmm. Our questions forge paths, and along the way of following these paths, we keep asking. That's kind of our method. And importantly, none of us, admittedly, are experts in LAPE. We really aren't. We're just searching together for different ways of thinking and practicing education, and we think that Latin American philosophy education can help us do that. So, to the aims. Like I already said, we're trying to introduce different theories of education from Latin America to an English-speaking audience that we typically aren't exposed to. In addition, we're also interested in producing new theory. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so, in general, you could say we're trying to enlarge the philosophy of education discourse, include more voices, and these are voices from Latin American philosophy of ed. Importantly, we also think that LAPE can play and should play a larger role in teacher formation programs. Or in other words, you might title this aim like, there is LAPE beyond Paulo Freire. I love Paulo Freire, but there's other people, and we're trying to talk about that. Now, this last aim is particularly related to 2 realities on the ground, particularly in the United States. One is that a growing Latino population here is mostly educated by teachers who've been formed principally by Eurocentric or U.S. educational philosophies of education. That's okay, but why not expand that? The second is we speculate, and this is speculation, that by including more LAPE in teacher formation programs, we might actually attract a more diverse teaching population to the field. Whether or not this holds true, we're not sure, but this is one of our speculations. Finally, and importantly, we have found that LAPE challenges hegemonic neoliberal educational theory in ways we find compelling. Perhaps then, through the study of LAPE, we can cultivate a counter-discourse and counter-conduct, or counter-conducts and counter-discourses, which help us challenge neoliberal ideology in U.S. education. I think there's evidence in countries that I think of right away, like Brazil and Chile, which bears some interesting results of this. I mean, one might say, well, why is there a large student movement in Chile? Why is there a large university professor movement in Brazil? What's the role of education in those movements? To what extent has Latin American philosophy of education influenced these movements coming into being? This is an area of research that we would like to investigate. So what do we do? Or in other words, how are we trying to accomplish what I just stated? In general terms, we're trying to cultivate what we're calling communities of inquiry, made up of K through 12 teachers, undergrad and graduate students, and of course, professors and academics interested in Latin American philosophy of education. And we're also very interdisciplinary in this approach. Obviously, we're housed at the Center for the Studies of Ethnicity and Race, and so there's people from many different areas that come to some of our encounters. So what we try and do then is have collective research, and there's a large emphasis on free and open public events where people have a genuine opportunity to think together. Some of these events include monthly lectures and discussions, which Ron Glass is going to give one next week, David in the future, other people, Eduardo, anyone else, you know. We had an annual symposium, or we have an annual symposium. The last one took place in November. In those symposium, we have in place what we call conversatorios, which are just encounters for people to get together and talk about the papers that have been presented. And then we have the reading laboratories, which you'll have an experience of today. We are also making Latin American philosophy of education texts available on our website. So they're free and open source. Anyone can go there and download those. Usually they're in Spanish and Portuguese, but we're also working on translation and trying to make more English available. And in September of 2014, we're going to publish our first edition of LAPES, the Journal of LAPES, which will have articles from Linda Martín Alcoff and Eduardo Mendieta, Samuel Rocha, and Maximiliano Lopez, along with some commentary from Eduardo. To close off, just a couple brief remarks on the nature of our research. And I think this is where not only do we have the most questions, but it'd be interesting to hear what the rest of the people think. I'm very interested in some of the theory of research here. Continuously, we're asking ourselves how to go about researching LAPE. And to be honest, I don't think we know for sure how to do this. We're experimenting. But I can say the following. So far, we've shied away from chronological historical approaches of investigation. Or in other words, we haven't traced the history of ideas or tried to trace systems of thought in Latin America throughout time. We can talk about why. Nor, and this is a more interesting one I think maybe, nor have we tried to peg theories to particular places in the region. And in fact, we aren't even sure how or if one should delimit LAPE to Latin America. This keeps coming up in a lot of our encounters. Like, what is Latin America? The region. How can you distinguish Latin American thought from other? I think this is a really interesting question. And Rodriguez is a good example of this. Maybe we'll get into this. So instead, our research is motivated by questions that we ask and others ask. And then we ask questions and try and find and learn how contemporary and past LAPE responds to these questions. So we begin with the question, then we look and see how are certain contemporary and past Latin American philosophers of education responding to these questions. We found that our questions then and the questions of others seem to cut across both time and space. In addition, and greatly influenced by the work of Linda Martín Alcoff, we tend to favor intersectional approaches to inquiry. In other words, we constantly ask how gender, race, socioeconomic realities matter. And finally, we're trying, and I think this is the point for you particularly, but we're trying to be very attentive to not only the content of LAPE, but also the form in which this content is expressed. And here I think it's helpful to return to Rodriguez, who once wrote that la forma es un modo de existir. Form is a manner of existence. And we speculate that the form of LAPE has a particularly important impact on the way that teachers are also being formed in Latin America. We're very drawn to the style of LAPE writing and presentation of theory, because we think that the styles of LAPE might infuse our own styles in the English-speaking world with new modes of expressing thought. And this would be a welcome addition to our field, because as Rodriguez again writes, "Si puede pintar sin hablar, pero no hablar sin pintar." You can paint without talking, but you can't talk without painting. And so we hope that in the reading laboratory you have a chance to explore LAPE with David. We hope that you begin to paint while talking, a new picture of education theory and practice by exploring some of the ideas of Simon Rodriguez. Before we get into that, just a real brief history of Rodriguez. He was born in 1769 and died in 1854. He was known as the Socrates de Caracas, a nickname given to him by his most famous student, Bolivar. He was an eternal nomad who wandered the earth, setting up schools for the excluded everywhere he went. Colombia, Peru, Chile, but also Russia, France, other places. People thought that Rodriguez was crazy, and maybe he was, but that's okay. Because like he wrote, he said, "Los locos y los niños dicen verdades." The crazies and children speak the truth. So no.
Okay, thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Jason. So,